This is the Mondo Weiss podcast. I'm Dave Reed. Student protests over Israel's genocidal war on Gaza are spreading across the United States and around the world. Students at Columbia University in New York set up a protest encampment last week on the campus. In response, the university's president, Nemat Minouche called in the New York Police Department, who arrested several student organizers. These students were then banned from campus and may face expulsion. If the goal was to quickly end the protest, this completely backfired on the university administration. Thousands of students, joined by faculty and staff from across the university, re-established the protest camp almost immediately. Other universities around the United States have seen solidarity camps erected and administration buildings occupied. Now, students around the world are joining the movement. Michael Aria and I spoke to one of the student organizers from Columbia who was arrested and banned from campus. Mariam Iqbal spoke to us on Tuesday. In the second segment, Michael reacts to Summer Lee's primary victory in Pennsylvania and previews his new election season newsletter.
Okay, so to start, I was wondering, we've been covering Columbia, obviously, for months and really years in many ways when it comes to this issue. I think, maybe people who have seen the news of the encampments are coming into the story only recently and don't really know some of the history leading up to this moment, particularly dating back to the fall when JVP and SJP chapters on campus were banned or suspended by the administration. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the climate on the campus kind of leading up to these recent protests.
Yeah, for sure. So prior to October, there really was no SJP. I mean, there was the SJP Instagram. I would DM them occasionally trying to join, and there was just no activity. I went to the club fair in September, and SJP wasn't even there. I remember JVP was taking signatures for SJP. And then in October, everything started. SJP finally got into movement. We had our first protest on October 12th, and the numbers were insane. We didn't expect it at all. There were hundreds of people showing up for Palestine, and we would protest consistently, and up to the point of suspension, the majority of our threats were external Zionist organizations, such as the guys behind the doxing trucks, or just in general, our main concern used to be doxing. But when November came around, we started getting a lot more disciplinary threats from the administration regarding unsanctioned protests, because I believe administration realized we weren't going to stop protesting as they had hoped. So that led up to the suspension of SJP and JVP for not complying with the rules for booking a protest many days in advance, which we had explained to administration was an unreasonable demand considering the urgency of the genocide. So once SJP and JVP were suspended by Columbia without following the correct procedure, there was a lot of outcry from the student body. It really, really galvanized the student body. And that caused a coalition to reform actually, because CU Apartheid Divest existed prior to October, but it was just, nobody was really talking about CU Apartheid Divest until SJP was suspended. So we have a coalition now of 120 plus student organizations at Columbia who are all in solidarity with the fight for Palestinian liberation. And since then, we've had protests, teach-ins, and all of these different events, but it's been very difficult because of administrative crackdown on us.
And I was wondering maybe if you could talk a little bit about some of the mainstream coverage that we've seen so far.
Yeah, I think it's really frustrating to see, especially the hyperfixation on campus safety. That's been something that has been at the front of all these conversations for the last few months. And that's the reason that I have been avoiding speaking to media up till now, because I don't like talking about campus safety when there's no universities left in Gaza. I don't want to center myself, or any college student for that matter, when, it's nothing compared to what's happening in Palestine. And I think it's a huge distraction. And right now we're looking at the media, they're really mischaracterizing what the encampment is. They're talking about it sounds like a battleground the way they're describing it, but really when you go there, it's very peaceful, and they're characterizing us as very anti-Semitic, but we're celebrating Jewish holidays on the encampment with our Jewish comrades. So it's just very misleading how they're portraying the encampment. And another thing that's really frustrating to me is the way in which Western media outlets have been reporting on the encampment itself. but without reporting on our demands or on the genocide that we are protesting. Because obviously we're protesting for a reason. We're not just causing a disruption for the fun of it. And it's been really upsetting to see this focus on just this hyperfixation on elite college campuses over the actual atrocities happening in Palestine.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit more about the coalition that is engaged in this encampment protest? You mentioned that you've been celebrating Jewish holidays, Jewish traditions during this current encampment protest. And of course, the accusations of anti-Semitism have become kind of the central focus of Zionist anti-Palestinian opposition groups. Can you talk about who exactly, from the Columbia's student body is engaged in the encampment protest?
Yeah, so I would actually say that Jewish students are disproportionately represented in our encampment. I mean, JVP members and Jews for Ceasefire, those are two organizations of anti-Zionist Jewish students, and they both shown out in such huge numbers to our encampment. And I think it's just very deeply insulting to them to be erasing their participation in this encampment it's so central to the encampment. And ever since October, SJP and JVP have been working in complete coalition since the very start. I mean, SJP doesn't do anything without JVP. We fully work together. And when the coalition formed, then we introduced all these other groups like the Black Students Organization, Muslim Students Association, and all of these other groups. But from the very start, it's been SJP and JVP.
Yeah. What are the specific demands that this encampment protest has given to the Columbia administration?
Yeah, so we're just occupying the lawn until divestment happens, because all of our protests from the very start have had the demand of divestment from all Zionist institutions, ending the dual degree program with Tel Aviv University, and canceling the opening of the Tel Aviv Global Center. So this is all encompassed in our demand for divestment.
I'm wondering what you've made of the administration's react. I know classes have moved online. They're now remote, but what kind of communication have you had with the administration, and how would you assess how they've reacted to the situation so far?
It's been shocking, honestly. I faced so much administrative repression for the last few months. I've been specifically targeted by both Barnard and Columbia administrations. I think what was shocking to me is that they don't learn from their mistakes, and that when they do these things to suppress students, it only galvanizes the student body even more. So, for example, if I was a Zionist administrator, I would not call the cops on my own students, because I know that would cause mass outrage in the student body and spark a new movement. This is what happened when they suspended SJP and JVP. It revitalized the student movement. So I'm just I fully expected administrative crackdown. I'm just surprised that they don't learn from their past mistakes.
We've seen some videos of there's that infamous kind of Columbia professor pro-Israel who's staging these kind of antics. And, I've seen videos of people waving Israeli flags, or people trying to provoke some sort of reaction. Have you ever any interaction with that kind of stuff? And what have you seen in terms of people infiltrating the encampment and maybe trying to provoke something?
I think in the encampment in general, there have been a lot of people trying to provoke things and instigate. But I really feel like student organizers have done a good job of not getting involved in that kind of stuff. But the problem is everything gets pinned on us regardless of whether or not we were involved in it. But we have a very strict policy of not engaging with instigators.
And what have you made of the movement spreading? I mean, it's hard to keep up with. It's obviously, more than a dozen, I guess, or maybe it's dozens by now. Universities have started their own encampments. I assume you've been paying attention to this, and kind of what do you make of it?
Yeah, I think it's just so beautiful to see. I don't think I expected this much to happen. I remember the night I got out of jail, I was just out of jail. I was trying to process everything, and someone comes up to me saying they occupied the other lawn. I was so shocked, because obviously when the arrests happened, all of the core student organizers had been arrested and taken to jail. And for the last few months, it's felt like we've had to put so much work into keeping the momentum for the students. For example, we would advertise a protest days in advance with a nice, pretty graphic, so people would show up. And then it's we get arrested and they organize their own thing on the spot. So this momentum, I've never seen anything like it before. And I don't think it'll end until divestment actually happens at every university that is involved in this.
Mariam, can you describe to us what your experience was like with the arrests, and as much as you feel comfortable with sharing with our audience, what you're dealing with now in terms of your position with the school and what the administration is doing to you and to other organizers as well that were arrested.
Yeah, for sure. So the morning of the arrests, before the arrest happened, I was suspended at around 10 a.m. with two other students. And these were the only suspensions to happen prior to the arrests. So shortly after we were all arrested, we were zip tied, put into vans, and we spent some time in jail. It was all a blur. I don't really remember much of it. But then after we got out, people started getting a lot of suspension notices from Barnard specifically. And Columbia students started getting suspension notifications when they went to retrieve their belongings that have been confiscated by public safety. And I think they were using that as a way to identify students. So they would show up and immediately get suspended because they were trying to get their belongings. So it's just been very underhand, very strange, insidious tactics that they've been using to get people. And I knew that I would be targeted at a more disproportionate level because specifically the Barnard administration has been targeting me for the last few months, me specifically as a member of SJP. So, for example, right now, Barnard students got the conduct notice that most of us are being granted amnesty and we can just accept disciplinary probation as opposed to just getting suspended. I was one of the 4 people who did not get that option. And that's what I expected to happen because I think that they have been consistently targeting me a lot. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw the mugshot type of thing they made of me, the no entry poster. So when I went to Barnard straight after being let out of jail and I was trying to get in and they weren't letting me, they were treating me like a criminal. For a whole hour I stood outside, it was midnight. And then they finally let me in and they timed me for 15 minutes on the phone. And the second the timer went off, I had to leave and find my own housing.
I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. Are you in a safe place now? I mean, are you handling this all right?
Yeah, I did have to leave town because unfortunately there's a lot of focus on me specifically in the news. So it's been difficult because of physical threats to my violence.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You've received actual physical threats?
Yeah, I was trying to stay around Columbia as long as I could, but I was being physically stalked and recorded by outside Zionists who I assume had been brought in by a lot of shy Davidites tweeting.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry you're having to deal with that.
Yeah.
Going forward, do you have a sense of where the Columbia encampment action is headed now? Are you still engaged in that organizing even though you're in another location, or have you had to step back from some of that organizing?
No, I've been very involved in organizing still, and I'm doing a lot of press stuff right now and handling comms basically for SJP. But I do plan on going back, obviously, because I do have a conduct hearing on this Friday, and it's in person and required.
What's next for the Columbia encampment?
I have no idea where it's going because I didn't even expect it to last this long. I really thought we would get swept the first day. I didn't expect this momentum to last. I have very strong faith that we will win our demands from this. I just don't know how long it'll take, but I don't think students are going to let up anytime soon.
Well, it's really been inspiring watching the students at Columbia, and what you helped to spark has now gone around the world. And it seems like we're witnessing a wave of student activism around Palestine that is really unprecedented. And a lot of that has to do with what you all did at Columbia. And I know you were a central figure in that. So thank you so much for your efforts, and stay strong. And we'll keep in touch with you and other students there at Columbia as this continues to unfold.
Yeah, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now to the 2024 election. 2 years ago, AIPAC spent over $4 million to defeat Summer Lee in Pennsylvania's 12th congressional district. Despite that huge amount of money, Lee won by less than 1,000 votes. This year, anti-Palestinian groups pulled out of the race and didn't spend any money to defeat Lee, who easily won her primary last night. Michael, what's the importance of last night's race?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, AIPAC and other pro-Israel groups like Democratic Majority for Israel spent heavily when Summer Lee first ran for this seat a couple years ago. And yeah, she only narrowly won by less than 1,000 votes, less than a point. So I think the expectation was that this time around, and AIPAC obviously spends the most money when we talk about these pro-Israel groups. It was fully expected that they would return, that they would spend big money again, and that Summer Lee was potentially in a vulnerable position. And the reality is they did not show up. That's correct. And I think that was surprising to everyone. And I think the big story out of this election is them not showing up and kind of viewing Lee's race as an unwinnable one, right? I mean, she fended off a challenge from a Edgewood council member named Bhavini Patel, who was, we should point out, backed by a PAC called Moderate PAC, which was specifically formed, I think, about a year ago to target progressive candidates. And it's primarily funded by Republican billionaire Jeffrey Yass, who, intervenes a lot in all kinds of elections. But his main focus is not Israel. So we should mention that, Lee was up against some big, I think something like $600,000 maybe was spent in terms of ads. But Lee herself did not accept any money from corporate PACs, unlike her opponent. But I think, the big story here is that we've seen in recent years, of course, poll after poll showing us that Democratic voters, not Democratic lawmakers, there's still a lag there. Summer Lee still represents kind of an outlier when it comes to even the House. She's part of this wider progressive group, sometimes referred to as the Squad, who have been consistently critical of Israel and have backed a ceasefire from the very beginning. She was one of the first House members to back a ceasefire. Virtually no one else did back in November, shortly after October 7th. And like I said, the numbers indicate that the Democratic base agrees with politicians like Summer Lee, like Rashida Tlaib, like Ilhan Omar when it comes to this issue. There was a poll a couple months ago from Data for Progress that actually found that 77%, just a staggering number of Democratic voters believe that President Biden should demand a permanent ceasefire in the region. And those numbers are pretty high even among independents. That same poll found that 69% of independents said they backed a ceasefire. So I think a couple things happened here. The first thing is that the ceasefire position is broadly popular among Democratic voters, and certainly voters in her 12th congressional district in Pennsylvania, which includes Pittsburgh and other places. And the attacks that she kind of endured, because AIPAC had originally had looked to target her at the very beginning of this race. And shortly after that began, and then shortly after Jeffrey Yass's involvement became public, Lee broke big records for herself in terms of donations. So she had this massive fundraising haul in the fourth quarter of 2023, raised over $1 million, and over 90% of those donations were less than $250. So, you have people in the community or maybe throughout the United States who saw these attacks on Lee and decided to support her. So I think that's the big story here because, AIPAC is set to spend over $100 million during this election. They will definitely be heard from. I don't think, this is a sign that AIPAC will have no impact on our 2024 election, obviously. But I think this is a huge story insofar as we saw somebody who people thought may have been vulnerable over her position on Palestine. And it seems to have been the exact opposite.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, Summer Lee is a member of the so-called Squad in Congress, along with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Jamal Bowman, a few others. They're using a lot of anti-AIPAC rhetoric in their campaigns this year, much stronger language than any candidates I can recall who were either incumbents or who had the potential to pull out a victory. What do you make of that strategy?
I would think, I kind of alluded to this already. I think when we see that kind of rhetoric, we have to remember that it's happening amid these massive kind of historic protests throughout the United States, right? The biggest anti-war protests that we've seen in the country in over 20 years now. That's 2024. So, there's this real momentum and support for a ceasefire and support for Palestine. And, people are becoming more and more skeptical of Israel. And I think, when that happens, when the public shifts, naturally you see the rhetoric of politicians shift, or, there's more room for that type of criticism. Last night during her victories, or after her victory effectively became apparent, Lee tweeted, "Opposing genocide is good politics and good policy," which is a direct swipe at AIPAC, who is always tweeting that, Democrats being pro-Israel is good politics and good policy. So, here we see a woman who just won her race by a pretty hefty margin, I think over 20 points with 95% of the vote in right now, using the word genocide to describe the situation in Gaza. That's part of it, I think, the fact that there's been this momentum among the general public and support for a ceasefire, and, also a deep skepticism of big money, of dark money in politics. The other thing I'd say, in the case of AIPAC, of course, they've run into a lot of backlash actually in the last few years. A couple years ago, when they first established these PACs to donate directly to candidates or to oppose candidates directly in the Democratic primaries, they, of course, also began giving money directly to Republicans, many of whom, refused to certify Biden's election in 2020. So I think that's also part of it, that AIPAC has really come under criticism from maybe people who aren't even consistently critical of Israel, just for, their open support for Republicans in races. I think, Democrats look at this and say, why is there a group that, supports pro-Trump politicians, pro-January 6th insurrection politicians? Why are they able to intervene in Democratic primaries, spend big money, and have an impact? And, Summer Lee is kind of a very important part of that story. The AIPAC, as you mentioned, spent over $4 million trying to stop her twice. If they had actually spent in last night's election and lost, it would be, of course, the third time that they had actually lost to Summer Lee, I think, which would be terrible for their kind of optics, because they obviously want to project this kind of image as a powerful force in American politics. And in the case of Lee, she beat in 2022 a guy named Steve Irwin, who was a former Republican staffer who was backed by AIPAC. And then she went on to beat GOP candidate Mike Doyle. And that AIPAC intervened in that race too. And that was the first time that AIPAC had ever intervened directly against a Democrat in a general election. So, yeah, I think we'll see more and more criticism of AIPAC and more attempts to kind of stop it. And we've even seen some efforts. We saw recently a coalition of progressive groups band together for calling themselves Reject AIPAC and are working kind of directly, on the Hill to try to stop them and lobby from the opposite direction. They obviously don't have anywhere near the money that a group like AIPAC does, but I think we can see that, especially in the case of Summer Lee, activism and grassroots politics can sometimes, beat back that big money.
Yeah. And what about this state treasurer race in Pennsylvania that happened last night? I know that wasn't on our radars, but it had some interesting Israel connections.
Yeah, I don't think it was on anyone's. I certainly barely saw anything about it going into this race, but a woman named Erin McClelland, who was a Democrat who ran for state treasurer, she actually opposed investing Pennsylvania's state pension funds in Israeli bonds. And that came in response to this additional $20 million that the current Republican state treasurer invested in Israeli bonds shortly after the Hamas attack of October 7th. So, yeah, I mean, it's maybe a small thing. I don't know how much it would get covered, but it's kind of just another example of how, this assumption that if you push back against Israel in any capacity or push back against the idea that they should be given effectively unlimited aid, that makes you politically vulnerable and you can't possibly win office in the United States. And I think it's just another example of how that might be changing.
Yeah, there's interesting stuff going on in Pennsylvania. Of course, John Fetterman, the senator there, has been one of the most stridently vocal, yes, even aggressively vocal supporters of Israel since October.
Yes, definitely. And to the right of the Biden administration on this issue has consistently criticized them on Twitter for providing aid to Gaza.
I'm sure we'll talk about Fetterman on this podcast with you in the coming months. Now, for the last few years, you've been writing a weekly email newsletter called The Shift, where you track the shifting politics around Palestine and Israel in the U.S., and you're launching an election season supplement to this newsletter. Tell us about it, and what can readers expect in this special election-focused email?
Sure. So we kind of developed this because we got to a point with this election. We always obviously cover at the site elections from our position, our angle when it comes to this issue. But it just seemed like there was too much to maybe shoehorn into our weekly newsletter, which covers more than the election, which covers all of the U.S. So, we have some major stories. We have this uncommitted campaign kind of, rolling throughout the United States where Democratic base is kind of turning on Biden or warning him that support for the genocide in Gaza could lead to his defeat in November. We have, like I said, an energized anti-war movement, unlike we've ever seen since 2003, since the beginning of the Iraq War. And these actually feel a lot more sustained. I mean, they've been going on since the fall. We have, these encampments. I don't even know at the time of us talking, and there's a whole bunch of them, maybe dozens right now throughout the United States, continue across campuses, continues to seem to grow. And I assume a lot of young voters or first-time voters in those encampments as well. And we have AIPAC, as I alluded to, that is set to spend over $100 million to try to oust progressive House members, progressive politicians that they believe are too critical of Israel or too supportive of Palestine. Someone like Summer Lee, it became clear, I think, going into this election, maybe like, a few weeks out, that she was probably going to win. There's other critics of Israel, people like Jamal Bowman in New York, people like Cori Bush in Missouri, who are probably more vulnerable. So there's just a lot of angles. And we felt like it might be good for our readers to kind of get all that information in one spot. So we're going to kind of roll out a supplement to the Shift that's going to come out also every week. And it's going to be a little more concise than the Shift. It's going to kind of just round up the things that people might want to pay attention to that week as they relate to the election, whether that's APEC spending, whether that's maybe a race you didn't hear about, like the treasurer race we just talked about, maybe some of those that, fall through the cracks when it comes to mainstream reporting, uncommitted movement, what this activism on the ground looks like for the election. So people will get kind of like a digestible, little roundup at the beginning of their week for kind of what to look out for. So that's kind of like how we envision it. And this will run obviously through November every week.
That's great. And listeners can visit our website and subscribe to the Shift email newsletter, and you'll get Michael's Thursday email as well as this election season supplement at the beginning of the week. Michael, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
That's our show. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, please go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the U.S. and around the world. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.